This vehicle is regarded by many as the best French heavy tank of World War II. It was built with strong armament and thick armor, and was chosen as the main type for the French army as their so-called battle tank. But it carried some design issues caused by its long development time, which was maybe the longest of every tank, as it started in 1920, just after the First World War. This was the Char B1 model, the tank that was in development for more than 1.5 decades. So let's see the history of this vehicle today. Tanks became an integral part of the military forces during the First World War, and the idea of the so-called battle tank appeared right after the war ended. The concept originates from General Jean-Baptiste Etienne, who had the idea for a tank that could bridge the gap between the light tanks like the Renault FT and the giant land battleships like the Char IIc. His basic concept was a 13-14 ton breakthrough tank, which can move together with the motorized infantry and carries a 75mm gun which it can use against fortifications. Turrets, even machine gun turrets, were only an optional feature in the original concept. The project to design this new tank was initiated in 1921, including 5 manufacturers: Delaunay-Belleville, FAMH, Renault, FCM, and Schneider. The original vision was to make the companies work together on a design, but in reality all of them came up with their own vehicles, except Renault and Schneider, who combined their efforts. The Delaunay-Belleville model was finished first, but their proposal was actually just an update on their earlier rejected design, which actually was just an enlarged Renault FT. In May 1924, the other 4 designs were presented, but due to the increased requirements, which now asked for 25mm frontal and 20mm side armor, and now a mandatory machine gun turret, none of the designs managed to meet the previously set weight limit. The FCM-21 used some parts from the IIc heavy tank, and it was the lightest from the 4 designs, weighing 15.6 tons. On the other hand, it was the longest, with 6.5 meters. It mounted the 75mm gun in the center of the hull, and used a 120 horsepower Panhard engine. The FAMH proposal, in contrast, was the shortest vehicle, with 5.2 meters length. It used the same Panhard engine as the FCM design, and mounted the main gun in the same manner, but it featured a new dual machine gun turret. Renault and Schneider presented 2 tanks, the A and B models. The SRA variant was equipped with a short 75mm gun in the hull, but unlike the FCM or FAMH designs, the gun was moved to the side to make more room for the driver. This vehicle was the heaviest with 19.5 tons because of its thicker 30mm armor plates, but thanks to its more powerful 180 horsepower Renault engine, its speed was comparable to the other designs. The SRB design was a bit longer but lighter at 18.5 tons, and it used a 47mm gun mounted in a similar fashion than the 75mm one on the SRA model. All of the designs had a top speed around 17 to 18 km an hour, but they range varied widely depending on the size of the vehicle and how much fuel storage it allowed. But during the comparison trials, all of these models proved to be unreliable, with several breakdowns and malfunctions. Since none of them were deemed satisfactory, but all of them had some notable technical features, it was decided to use the best parts from each vehicle, and create one design from which, as it was hoped, hundreds of units will be manufactured. So based on the experiences, new requirements were set in 1925 to use the basic layout and profile of the SRA and SRB models with the gun on the side, the more powerful Renault engine with Schneider differential, and the track setup from the FCM model but with new suspension design. The armor thickness was increased to 40mm on the front and 30mm on the sides, and the estimated weight for this new tank was around 20 to 22 tons. Renault was tasked to coordinate the development of this new design, and the mock-up for the new model was finished by 1926. It had a similar layout as its predecessors, but it was longer and bigger. The tracks and suspension were fully reworked, and the crew was increased to 4 men. Soon it was decided to order 3 prototypes, one each from Renault, FCM and FAMH. However, the final requirements were still changing during this year, so the contracts for the prototypes were only signed in March 1927. The first of these models was finished by Renault in January 1929, but its armament was only installed in April 1930. This model now had an upgraded 250 horsepower engine to cope with the increased weight of the vehicle. So as you can see, the French at this point already spent a decade on this tank project, and they just managed to finish the first prototype. During 1930, testing of the new tank began, which, though weighing 25 tons, was heavier than requested, still managed to reach a top speed of 24 km an hour. As part of the trials, the prototype also did a 250 km trip with 16 km an hour average speed, which at the time was considered very good, both in speed and in the fact that it managed to finish the trip without breaking down. So finally the new tank, after more than a decade, reached an acceptable form. But since it was in development for long years, in 1930 another modernization was in order. So new requirements arrived, which also included changes based on the experiences with the first prototype. The second and third models were both delivered a year later, including these changes. The biggest one being the requirement of a 47mm gun in the turret instead of machine guns. During trials, many different changes were tested on the design. Different turrets, suspension modifications and gearboxes, and even diesel engines were installed in the tanks. But at the end of 1932, the project finally arrived to a design that seemed finished. So in theory, after testing, the production of the type could have begun, right? Wrong. By the time the design reached this point, several other factors came into play, hampering the project. The infantry would have liked a bigger number of smaller tanks, not big, expensive ones, which are slow to manufacture. So development of lighter tank designs like the Char B1 or the FCM-36 were also in progress. On the other end of the spectrum, in 1930 a new program was started for even heavier battle tank designs. And by 1932 three options were laid out. The Char B2, a 35-ton tank with 50mm of armor and a long 75mm gun. The B3, which would have been a 45-ton design with 75mm and 47mm guns and 6-man crew. And finally the BB model, a giant 60-ton tank with two 75mm guns and 8-man crew. Of course, as we know, none of these gone anywhere, apart from a mock-up for the BB type, but they added confusion to the French tank development and used up valuable resources and time. The other problem for the Char B1 came from outside France. By this time the League of Nations discussed many armament reduction treaties, and some of these included weight limitations for future tank designs. So the French held the production orders for the Char B1, and in the meantime they started the development of the smaller D2 model, which was seen as a good replacement in case the armament treaty would ban heavier tanks. I have already made a video on the Char D2, so if you want to know more about that type, check it out. However, the League of Nations couldn't reach an agreement on the treaty in 1932, and by October 1933, Germany left the organization altogether. So finally, the Char B1 design was not in danger of being banned, and in March 1934, a mere 13 years after the beginning of the project, Renault received an order for 7 Char B1 models. In December, they received another order for 20 units, but the company was already overloaded with work, building the D1 and D2 models as well. So production of the new heavy tank was very slow. The first B1 model was only finished a year later, in December 1935, and Renault only finished the order for the first 7 units in May 1936, almost 2 years after they were ordered. The problems at Renault pushed the French government to take drastic actions, and finally, at the end of 1936, the tank production at Issy-les-Moulineaux was nationalized, creating a new company, AMX. Apart from the very slow production, these tanks were very expensive to build as well. Actually, they were the most expensive tanks at the time, costing more than 1,200,000 francs each, more than double the price of the D2 model. So in 1936, the Char B1 model, after 15 years, finally was finished and entered production. But by this time, with the appearance of the newer anti-tank guns, like the French SA-35, which all had higher penetration than older models, the original 40mm armor on the B1 was not adequate anymore. So just after the type entered service, a modernization program was started again. The front armor plate was increased to 60mm of thickness, and the size to 55mm, making the tank almost impenetrable to the anti-tank guns of the time. The turret was also upgraded to the new APX-4 model, which featured 55mm thick armor all around, and housed the long-barreled SA-35 47mm gun. To cope with the increased weight, which was now over 31 tons, the engine power was raised to 300 horsepower, and the suspension and tracks were also modified. The upgraded models were named B1 bis, and they became the main production type from 1937. There was actually another, even more heavily armored version of the type, the B1 Ter variant. And this model also added new features to the design. Initially, it was planned to have a weight of around 45 tons, but the engineers managed to keep the weight under 40 tons, mostly by using sloped armor on the new design. Another improvement over the B1 bis variant was that the 75mm cannon in the hull was able to traverse horizontally, unlike on the earlier models. The new variant was tested during 1938, and eventually it was meant to replace the B1 bis variant, but time was running out for the project, and only 3 prototypes were finished before the fall of France in 1940. The Char B1 was a big tank, 6.37 meters long, 2.58 meters wide, and 2.79 meters tall. It featured 60mm thick armor on the front and 55mm on the sides. Even the rear section was heavily armored with 50mm thick armor plates. The late model APX-4 turret featured 55mm thick armor all around. But because of the heavy armor, the tank weighted more than 31 tons. It was powered by a 307 horsepower petrol engine and had a maximum speed of 25 km an hour, but it only had a range of around 160 km, and this caused a lot of trouble for the design later. The tank's main armament included the 47mm SA-35 gun in the turret and the 75mm howitzer in the hull. The secondary armament consisted of 2 7.5mm machine guns, one in the turret and one in the bow. And now, let's see the service history of the Char B1 and how it faced against the German onslaught during the Battle of France. The Char B1 entered service in 1936, and in less than a year, the upgraded B1 bis models were already introduced. But the production of the type was still very slow. The first order for 35 B1 bis models took about a year to finish, with the first tank leaving the factory in April 1937 and the last one in March 1938. Despite the glacial manufacturing speed, the first order was soon followed by a second one, again for 35 units, then a third for 70 tanks in February 1938. By the time World War II broke out, the French managed to build around 370 B1 and B1 bis models, and another 400 was ordered immediately after the outbreak of the war in September 1939. But by June 1940, only 403 units were produced from the ordered 1,178. Some of the lost models even left the factories without turrets, and they were sent to battle like that, showing the desperation of the French forces. The Char B1, originally designed as a breakthrough tank, featured very strong armor and very good trench crossing abilities, but it lacked the mobility needed for the new type of maneuvering warfare, and because of its short range, it had to refuel frequently. Their strong armor and armament, compared to the German tanks they faced, still made the B1s formidable in tank-on-tank engagements, but their low numbers, slow speed, and small one-man turret were big drawbacks. The coordination of the tank forces was greatly hindered by the lack of communication, as the tanks were only equipped with very basic radios, which were only able to transmit Morse code. So even though in technical terms the B1 design was a much stronger tank than its opponents, but the Germans quickly learned their weaknesses, and the big tanks were many times isolated, flanked, and destroyed, despite their strong armor protection. The Char B1s were organized in specialized breakthrough units, but as it turned out, the French theories about the coming war were all wrong, and instead of the slow trench warfare, similar to what they saw in the Great War, this conflict was highly mobile, and the French tactics and vehicles were not prepared for that. More than 160 of these tanks were captured by the Germans, who put them to use, some as support vehicles or training tanks. Some were converted to carry flamethrowers, and some were modified to carry a 105mm howitzer. They were still in service, and some of them were recaptured after the Allied invasion of France, and they were used by the French resistance fighters and later the reformed French forces. The surviving B1 models were used until the end of the war, but the French heavy tanks history didn't end just then. Many of the features from the B1 were used in a design that was partly developed during the war under the German occupation, and entered service with the French forces a few years later. This was the ARL-44 heavy tank, but we will look at that vehicle in a later video. The Char B1, from a technical standpoint, was a formidable tank in the early years of World War II, but it carried many outdated design features, thanks to its extremely long development time. But despite all of its faults, it's still one of the iconic vehicles of World War II. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.